Hello there, my name is Mr. Beasley, and in this video we're going to be having a look at Wilfred Owen's most famous poem, Dulce et Decorum est. The poem was written in 1917 when Wilfred Owen was in Craig Lockhart Hospital, having been diagnosed with shell shock. And while at the hospital, Owen met another very famous poet, Siegfried Sassoon, who played a very important role in encouraging Owen's poetry and editing his early drafts. The central image in this poem is of a soldier suffering from the effects of chlorine gas, which was one of several chemical weapons used during the First World War to immobilise or kill soldiers. The poem is written in the first person, and much of it is in the present tense, so the terrible realism of this event is enhanced, not only by recognising that Owen is describing something that he will have seen firsthand, but also by Owen inviting, and in some sense insisting, that the reader watch alongside him. Dulce et Decorum est is part of a Latin phrase, Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori, which literally means it is sweet and fitting to die for your country. And the purpose of this poem is to state with absolute passion and certainty not only how wrong this sentiment is, but more importantly how wrong it is for those back in England to be using slogans like this as a way of persuading more young men to go out and fight. The poem begins with an image of a group of soldiers leaving the frontline trenches and walking slowly and wearily towards a place of safety and rest. Owen creates a sense of the terrible state of the soldiers by describing them as bent double, suggesting they can barely hold themselves up. And this is followed by a series of images of how the soldiers who would have been young, fit men before going to war have been prematurely aged. The simile, like old beggars under sacks, is followed by another, coughing like hags, which combine to create a picture of men who are in a pretty wretched state, ill, poorly equipped, and barely recognisable as human beings. And between these two similes is the alliterative knock-kneed, which further adds to the image of deformity and mimics the sound of bones striking against each other as the soldiers struggle to hold themselves up. And the condition of the soldiers is further compounded by the terrible conditions they're experiencing underfoot. In a letter to his mother, Owen once described craters filled with waist-high water and mud. Men, he said, had been known to drown in them. Here, the sludge is thick enough to cause the men to curse and swear, and deep enough to suck the boots from the soldiers' feet, so that the men are further injured, bloodshot, by marching barefoot. It was a recurring theme in Owen's poetry that the men who fought in the war were treated as little better than animals. You can see an example of this in Anthem for Doomed Youth, which opens with the line, "What passing bells for those who die as cattle." And here the verb shod refers to shoes, specifically when talking about horses, and so the phrase bloodshod combines Owen's view of the way that the soldiers are treated and become dehumanised by war, while at the same time creating an image of the soldiers wearing shoes of blood. Understandably then, the men are exhausted. Some, either literally or metaphorically, are marching asleep. They are lame, which means they can hardly walk, blind, deaf, and metaphorically drunk with fatigue, which creates an image of the men stumbling along as if they are intoxicated. It's like the soldiers' whole sensory experience is shutting down. They've experienced so much horror and exhaustion that in this state, the only thing they can do is stumble away from the front line in the hope of finding relief. Their senses are impaired so much that they are even deaf to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. It's worth mentioning that this line is edited by some online versions of the poem. I'm not sure why, because it isn't complicated. 5-9s refers to the 5.9-inch diameter measurement of the shells used to carry gas. But anyway, the men are far enough away from the fighting to be right on the limit of the enemy cannon's range, so that even the shells fired at them have become tired. But they reach them nonetheless, and these shells contain chlorine gas. Now, before moving on, I'm just going to make a couple of points about the structure of this poem. Now you can work out a poem's rhyme scheme by looking at the lines which rhyme and coding them like this. So you can see an A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D pattern emerging, and this continues throughout the poem. All of the lines have roughly 10 syllables, and many of them are written in iambic pentameter, which means that it's every other syllable that is stressed. So, moving on. There's a dramatic increase in pace in the next part of the poem as we are alerted to the gas attack at the same time as the soldiers in the poem by the direct speech which begins the second stanza. The panicked tone of this is indicated by the repetition, gas, gas, quick boys! The soldiers then scramble to find and fit their gas masks, but these box respirators were awkward and difficult to fit correctly. An ecstasy of fumbling describes the frenzied, clumsy movements of the soldiers trying to protect themselves from the effects of the gas, which most of them managed to do just in time. However, one of the group is not so lucky, and what is described in the rest of this middle part of the poem is the soldier suffering from the effects of the gas. You'll notice that Owen employs a sequence of present tense verbs which have the effect of bringing the action right before our eyes, as Owen insists that we observe the man's agony at the same time as the poet. We've got the verb yelling to indicate his fear and terror, followed by stumbling and then floundering, which describe his panicked, uncoordinated movements as the effects of the gas start to take hold. His movements, Owen tells us, are similar to those of a man on fire. The reference to lime, which I've indicated here, is particularly unsettling. As well as reducing the smell, lime was poured over dead bodies, especially those buried in mass graves, as a disinfectant and to aid the process of decomposition. So lime suggests the dissolving effects of ingesting chlorine gas, while also pointing towards the soldier's death. We're then taken inside the gas mask of Wilfred Owen, and we look through the eyepiece as he would have done and see the soldiers suffering firsthand. And the scene takes on the dimensions of a nightmare. There's an eerie, thick, green light as the chlorine gas hangs heavily in the air, slowly dispersing around them. And there is so much of it that Owen compares what he sees, firstly using a simile, as under a green sea, and then by the metaphorical "I saw him drowning," which continues the image. The effect is horrifying to imagine. Once ingested, the chlorine gas would have started to dissolve the tissues in the lungs, making it difficult to breathe, a sensation very similar to drowning. And the word drowning is repeated at the end of the next sequence of present tense verbs as Owen recalls him plunging at him, desperate for oxygen. To plunge suggests the rapid, violent, but uncoordinated movement of the man, while also, of course, continuing the comparison with him being underwater. Choking is straightforward enough for us to understand in this context, but guttering is worth explaining in a bit more detail because it describes the behaviour of a candle that's about to go out. The flaring dance of a low-burning flame consuming the last remnants of its fuel before finally becoming extinguished works as an effective comparison to what is happening to the soldier, desperately gasping for breath and about to expire. The man's suffering is so terrible that the image of it becomes imprinted on Owen's mind, enhanced by his own feelings of helplessness, and the poet-narrator tells us the memory comes back to him in all his dreams. The final part of this poem serves two purposes. Firstly, it describes what happens to the injured soldier next, and secondly, it directly addresses the reader in a visceral, angry tone in order to convey his message. And as I've said before, the imagined audience for this poem is the people back home in England, specifically those who might use war propaganda to encourage young men like Owen to go out to France and fight for their country. And in the final part of the poem, Owen's intention in describing these horrific events becomes clear. The section begins with the conditional connective if, and we can see that he started addressing the audience directly with the pronoun you. Owen is challenging the reader here to consider what it would be like if they too had this terrible image of what happened to the injured soldier next coming back to them in their dreams. The adjective smothering, which is used to describe what these dreams would be like, is another word suggestive both of fires being snuffed out and the act of depriving another person of air. And so Owen is sort of saying to his reader back home that if, like him, they had these dreams, they would be so horrendous that they would almost experience the same feelings of drowning as the injured man. So, I said that this section describes what happens to the soldier next, and we can see that he was picked up and flung onto the back of a wagon. The verb flung sounds careless and disrespectful to the suffering of the soldier, and that's sort of the point. There's been so much death and violence experienced by these men that the victim of the gas attack becomes just another body. There's no dignity or honour involved in this man's sacrifice. It's also effective, I think, at conveying the lifeless state of the soldier being lumped in a rough and uncontrolled way into the back of a wagon. Owen describes himself pacing behind this wagon with the remaining soldiers and watching the white eyes writhing in the victim's face, which is another vivid image of the soldier's pain, his eyes rolling around in his head, while the rest of his features have a hanging, lifeless quality to them. And remember that Owen is showing this to his audience and talking directly to the men and women back home. He might encourage soldiers to go and fight, and he's saying, if you had seen this, and then if you had heard this, as he goes on to describe at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. He wants them to see and hear the soldier's distress as graphically as possible, and so he paints a picture of the wagon bumping over the uneven ground, adding to the man's agony as the dissolving lungs turn tissue to poisonous froth that gargles in the man's throat as he tries to breathe. The simile, which I've highlighted here, compares his face to a devil's sick of sin, which seems to suggest a sickness with the evil of war, a sickness so great that even a devil would have grown tired of it. There's alliteration in this line too, sick of sin. And where we get this S noise being repeated, it's called sibilance, and it makes the simile sound even more bitter and angry as the consonants are hissed out. Owen uses another pair of similes here to describe the sight of the man's blood as it gargles out of his mouth. Obscene can have a range of meanings, from simply hideous or dreadful to something gross or indecent, and so this simile implies that, just like cancer, the man's blood is a sight that should never have been seen. On one level, the second simile, bitter as the cud, works in the same way as several other of Owen's images in that it connects the soldiers to animals. Cud is the half-digested food that some animals regurgitate in order to break it down. The cud contains fatty acids which help the animal to digest, and it's this acidic burning going on in the mouth of an animal that Owen is referring to here, comparing it to the poisonous burning froth coming from the soldier's mouth. The further impact of this is the vile, incurable sores referred to in the next line. And the fact that the adjective innocent is used at the end of this sequence of images has two important effects. Firstly, it reminds us again of the soldier's youth. These would have been fit young men going out to fight. I mean, in 1914, the minimum legal age to fight overseas was 19, but most people didn't have birth certificates, and so it was easy to lie about your age, and it's estimated that about 250,000 underage soldiers signed up to fight, carried along on a wave of patriotism and propaganda. And it's the second of these that Owen is really taking aim at in this poem. The adjective innocent contrasts with those whom Owen points the finger of guilt and responsibility towards at the final part of the poem. And as I've said before, these are the people back home in England who are encouraging young men to go out and die for their country. He addresses them as my friend. But he's being ironic here. The tone is bitter, angry as he tells them, if you had seen what I have just described, then you would not with such enthusiasm be telling children that it's sweet and right to die for your country. Many of these children would have lived pretty dreary lives and would probably have loved being told that they could find excitement and glory on the battlefields of France. But this was a lie, an old lie, because originally this Latin phrase was penned by an Italian poet called Horace, who was born in the year 65 BC and wrote a series of patriotic odes. And Dulce et Decorum est is far from a patriotic poem. And so the title itself is an ironic comment on the sort of jingoistic language being used to support the war effort. And there is nothing sweet or fitting in this soldier's death. It is brutal, nasty, painful and pointless, one of the millions sacrificed on the fields of France. And Owen himself would add to this number. He was shot and killed trying to cross a canal 1 week before the war ended, and the armistice was signed on the 4th of November 1918. He was just 25 years old.